preparing kingside expansion, and fianchettoing the bishop to exert pressure on the long diagonal. Immediately challenging white's flank opening with a central pawn thrust, aiming to seize early territorial advantage and restrict white's g3 development. Developing the knight to f3 now supports a potential kingside fianchetto and prepares for castling, harmonizing with the initial g3 pawn push. Developing the knight to a natural square, bolstering the center and preparing for queenside expansion. Developing the bishop to its fianchetto aims for long-term influence on the central diagonals, setting a subtle trap for black's pieces. Solidifying the center and preparing development, black creates a robust pawn structure that will demand white's careful attention. Safeguarding the monarch is paramount, instantly securing the king's safety for future strategic maneuvers. Solidifying the kingside and preparing to challenge the center, this bishop prepares for the eventual advance of the d-pawn. Challenging the center immediately, seeking to break down black's pawn structure and potentially open lines for the pieces. Solidifying the king's safety is paramount as the central battle intensifies. Solidifying the queenside structure and preparing for NC to challenge the center while keeping options open for the queenside pawn advance. Solidifying the pawn chain, black prepares for a stable development and contests the center with a firm hand. Developing the bishop to this square offers diagonal pressure on black's queenside structure while preparing for pawn advances. Black seizes queenside space, immediately challenging white's pawn chain and aiming to disrupt white's central control with aggressive counterplay. Establishing central presence and preparing for potential pawn advances on the kingside. Developing the knight to d7 subtly prepares for a potential queenside expansion, while also reinforcing the central control. Solidifying the knight's position enhances central control, preparing a potential advance of the d-pawn or further piece development towards the kingside. That bishop now eyes the long diagonal, preparing to contest control of those central squares. Reinforcing the queenside pawn advance, while preparing a future kingside pawn storm. Shifting the rook from its prior post to the open file signals a readiness to contest central control and potentially disrupt white's pawn structure. Initiating a central pawn push to contest space and potentially open lines for attackers. Activating the queen to exert pressure on the queenside and potentially prepare a central breakthrough. Opening the king's diagonal dramatically reshapes the central fight, daring black to commit their knights or find immediate counterplay. Centralizing the knight with e8 prepares for a dynamic redeployment, potentially to g6 or f5, contesting white's queenside expansion. Solidifying the pawn center opens up more long-term strategic possibilities and prepares to challenge black's queenside buildup. Boldly challenging white's central grip, this pawn thrust opens crucial diagonals for black's pieces. Pushing the queenside pawn chain, white aggressively contests central space and aims to disrupt black's pawn structure. Shattering white's central pawn chain creates immediate piece activity. Aggressively seizing central space, white gambles on a kingside initiative fueled by the pawn chain's forward thrust. Shifting the queen to c7 prepares to reinforce the center and potentially challenge white's advanced pawn. Preparing to seize the queenside initiative and apply pressure to black's pawn structure. That bishop anchors the queenside pawn chain, creating a dynamic outpost for the knight and potentially igniting a kingside assault. Preparing to expand on the kingside, this rook offers support for an eventual f4 push, aiming to exploit black's slightly congested pawn structure. Gaining central control and potential kingside play now becomes black's priority, though this weakens the dark squares. This pawn advance aims to disrupt black's queenside setup and gain a foothold on the queenside, but risks overextension if not adequately supported. Sacrificing the central pawn opens ambitious tactical lines, forcing white into a dynamic response. The queen's re-entry opens up queenside possibilities, but watch out for the pawn structure's vulnerability. Mobilizing the rook to the open, a file seeks counterplay but sacrifices valuable central space for it. The bishop relocates, aiming to control the long diagonal and support potential pawn, advances further down the board. The bishop now retreats, relinquishing control of key central squares and signaling a defensive posture rather than an active challenge. Repositioning the knight to potentially control the central e5 pawn and threaten black's queenside structure creates active possibilities. The knight ventures to the rim, eyeing central control and preparing to support a potential kingside pawn storm. Exploiting the backward knight, this aggressive bishop maneuver seeks to disrupt black's coordination and open lines towards the weakened queenside. Unlocking the queenside requires careful maneuvering, but this retreat invites further pressure. Disrupting black's bishop diagonal offers improved piece activity. Reactivating the rook, it prepares to contest the d-file, aiming to break white's central grip. The knight leaps to an advanced outpost, disrupting black's pawn structure and eyeing vulnerable squares. Repositioning the queen to c7 avoids the knight's harassment and prepares a potential counterthrust along the c-file. Repositioning the rook to a more active file will likely pressure black's weakened queenside pawn structure. Shifting focus, black prepares to contest the crucial queenside squares and potentially launch an offensive pawn thrust. Bolstering the knight's central influence now begins a subtle repositioning contest. Initiating a pawn thrust to disrupt white's knight outpost and potentially open lines for counterplay. This repositioning of the queen seeks to prepare for a potential kingside pawn storm, aiming to exploit the weakened structure created by black's pawn push. Exploiting the queenside pawn structure, black aims to disrupt white's camp with this pawn thrust. Unlocking the queenside, white snatches a pawn, aiming to exploit the weakened structure. Unleashing the rook's power down the semi-open file, aiming to dislodge the enemy queen and exploit the weakened queenside. Centering the queen on the open c-file now exerts significant pressure, aiming to exploit the exposed black monarch. This maneuver aims to liberate the rook from its passive defensive post. Reactivating the kingside defender to eye the queenside pawn chain offers a dynamic counterplay. This creates a fascinating pawn structure and opens lines, potentially activating black's king even as it weakens its defensive shield. Clearing the knight from the outpost, a pivotal moment to exploit black's exposed king and create attacking chances. Reclaiming the queen in this chaotic melee centralizes her, but leaves the queenside pawns exposed to further white pressure. The bishop retreats, aiming to redeploy and support the central pawn push, though it allows for potential counterplay on the kingside. Opening the center often invites counterplay. Now black must manage the ensuing complications and watch the central pawn structure. Initiating a decisive rook exchange opens the b-file for a powerful infiltration. Reclaiming the pawn opens a crucial diagonal for your queen and centralizes her influence. Capturing the pawn strategically opens the d-file, creating an immediate threat against black's isolated queen and forcing them to react defensively. A bold gambit to open lines, seeking counterplay amidst the central bind. Unpinning the knight from the rook opens up the d-file, creating immediate attacking chances. Reclaiming the central pawn strengthens black's queenside pawn structure significantly. Seizing the open file with the rook gambles on immediate pressure, hoping to unravel black's pawn structure before full piece development catches up. Retaking the rook opens critical files, aiming to disrupt white's central control and exploit any lingering weaknesses in the pawn structure. Exploiting the open diagonal, the queen swings into action, creating immediate threats and simplifying towards a favorable endgame. Reclaiming material with the queen, black aims to stabilize the position and consolidate their material advantage. Initiating a swift central pawn thrust to seize initiative and disrupt black's defenses. Activating the queen to join the central skirmish while considering a potential pawn push towards the weakened kingside. A forcing check, aiming to simplify the position and exploit the black king's exposed location. Activating the knight to a more central square offers counterplay and prepares for future pawn advances. The knight's relocation to the open flank reclaims space and targets the vulnerable enemy king. Restoring peace harmony, this knight seeks to bolster its central presence and potentially support a d-pawn advance, aiming for a more dynamic endgame. Securing the knight's position and preparing for a central pawn advance is key here. Trading queens here simplifies into an endgame where white's active rook and knight will likely dominate. White finally consolidates gains, securing control of the open d-file for a decisive endgame advantage. The knight's repositioning to b5 aims to infiltrate white's position and create threats, a dynamic attempt to inject life into black's otherwise passive pieces. Seizing the initiative, this knight injection prepares a kingside pawn push, aiming to restrict black's bishop and gain more space. Propping up the king with the knight offers a touch more safety from the rook's gaze. Dominating the d-file, this knight repositions to threaten a crucial outpost,